Tonight's mystery is the true story of a little boy who experienced horrible moments from the past. Who was that old man in Andy's room? And why had he put that little girl into a wooden box? This mystery just might leave us with more questions than answers. Here's my husband Damon with the details.
It was just about midnight in the autumn of 1992 when 10-year-old Andy Hopkins, who thought that he was alone, saw an old man's reflection in his bedroom window. The old man was crouching over Andy's bed just behind Andy with this terrifying expression on his face. Well, at first, Andy hoped that maybe this was just another apparition. At this point, he had seen so many of them. But just moments later, he was violently jerked off of the bed and then dragged across his bedroom floor. Apparitions don't drag people. Somehow, this was real.
I couldn't see my attacker, but I could smell him. Rotten and putrid. I could hear his low moan and his gravelly laugh.
The old man continued to drag Andy. And then Andy felt rain, and then he heard digging, and he wondered if anyone would hear him when he died.
Heard this man's voice say my name.
Andy.
He asked me if I was scared.
What's the matter, Andy? Are you scared?
Andy just knew that this was it, and he was going to die. So how in the world had things gotten here? I mean, ghost stories aren't supposed to become physical and real, right? Well, maybe the first red flag should have been when he met Ethel. Sure, Ethel was nice, but she wasn't human.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share true stories of the unexplained. I research the cases, and my husband gives the details.
Andy saw his first apparition when he was only 5 in the summer of 1987. That year, he and his family moved into a modest 3-bedroom home on Park Road in Coalville, Leicestershire. The house was old. It had been built somewhere around the turn of the century to accommodate coal miners. Well, for a while, everything felt normal. But then, one night, in the early morning hours, Andy awoke to a sudden, powerful chill. The only light was coming from the crack beneath his bedroom door. This created eerie shadows throughout the bedroom. And then he saw her. Standing calmly beside his desk was this elderly woman, and her hands were clasped gently at her waist. The only thing was, she wasn't made of one of these eerie shadows. No, she was solid.
No one I had ever seen had looked so well dressed and proper.
Later, he said that she looked almost posh. The kind of woman who made sure that every detail was always in place. Well, she smiled at Andy, raised a hand, and gave this cheeky wave, and then strangely, the coldness vanished, replaced by this strong sense of safety and security. And then, without a sound, she turned and, now, check this out. What he at first thought was this solid physical person somehow walked straight through the bedroom wall, as if the wall wasn't even there. Oddly, however, this didn't frighten Andy at all. Instead, he felt calm. But he did wonder if maybe all of this had been just a dream.
It was so real, so vivid, and I thought I knew for sure that I'd been awake. It kept me puzzled, and it made me think again and again if I really had seen someone.
The next morning, he saw a picture of this woman who he later referred to as Ethel. In the photo, she was surrounded by 3 elderly men smiling brightly as one of them held up a birthday cake in front of her. The caption explained that she had passed away shortly after that photo had been taken. Well, at that moment, Andy knew that this hadn't been a dream. No, this woman's ghost had somehow been in his bedroom last night. Ethel was the first spirit that Andy saw in that house, but she wouldn't be the last. Now, as the months passed, other things began to happen. Footsteps could be heard on the stairs when no one was there. The sound of children running outside echoed at all hours, even in the middle of the night when the neighbors were all asleep. All of this felt harmless, loving even. But then, one winter night in 1987, the atmosphere of the house changed. Lying in bed, Andy heard the floorboards creaking just outside of his bedroom door. So he called out, hoping that it was his sister, but there was no answer. Then the door slowly began to open, and light from the hallway filled his bedroom. But instantly it was dimmed as this strange shadowy figure melted across the threshold.
I saw a distorted arm reaching around, stretching and growing at whim, reaching and grasping for anyone within reach. Then I saw its head move into the room, stretching to nearly the height of the ceiling. It had no eyes, but I felt it searching, and I prayed that it couldn't see me. The shadow had no solid form, but it was alive, and it was not just on the walls. It floated in the room in 3 dimensions.
Strangely, Andy said that after a moment, it melted into a poster on his bedroom wall.
I watched as the character in the poster came alive. The face seemed to pull itself out of the picture, and the character moved its head and looked around the room.
Andy just knew that this thing was looking for him, and he prayed that it did not find him. Well, after a moment, the character in the poster went back to normal, and the shadow left the wall.
The shadow drifted outward as a black mist, slowly taking the form of an old man whose face was frozen, with his mouth open, as if he were in the middle of an angry shout.
A moment later, this terrifying image rushed straight toward Andy, but it dissipated at the very last moment. Well, Andy, of course, screamed, and then he immediately jumped out of the bed and rushed toward the bedroom door. But at the very last moment, something caused Andy to stop and turn around.
I looked back towards my bed and saw the shadow, solid and very much there, casting a soulless stare at me. And that is when I heard his laugh, a low, chesty chuckle that still haunts me to this day.
A moment later, the shadow melted into all of the others, becoming indistinguishable from those around it, and then Andy's mother rushed into the room. "Don't worry, sweetheart. This was all just a horrible nightmare." But of course, Andy knew differently. The kind presence of Ethel had been the first visitor, but now something far darker was coming for Andy.
Velarcana.
The ghost activity in this house on Park Road would fluctuate. There were long stretches when nothing happened. Well, that's not exactly correct. During those quiet times, Andy really thought that maybe he could hear soft whispers from different corners of the house, and at times he even thought he heard his name being called. But he was never sure. Strangely, these quieter periods often followed bigger events. It was almost as if whatever was in this house needed time or something to gather its strength again. One afternoon in the spring of 1988, while Andy was sitting in the front room laughing at a television show, his brother Gary, grumpy and irritated, entered the room behind him and told him to shut up. Well, in spite, Andy just laughed louder. Then the voice came again, much huskier this time. What? That wasn't Gary's voice. So Andy turned around, and no one was there. Well, he kind of brushed this off and went back to watching television. A moment later, he felt a hand pressing on the back of his head, and then it shoved him so hard that it jarred his neck. He cried out in pain, and he spun around, but again, the room was completely empty. Chilling, isn't it? Well, by the summer of 1988, Andy had begun to understand that the unseen presence in his house sometimes responded. So one day, he decided to see just how far he could take this. He spoke out loud and he asked whoever or whatever was there to bring him a specific toy. And he waited, but nothing happened. At least, not right then. See, just a little while later, he found that exact toy in a place that he had not left it. Something had moved it. Then, in the spring of 1992, Andy encountered something entirely different. Something much more tangible. He was headed upstairs to his room when he noticed this doll that was left on the top step. So he gave it a kick as he passed, not really thinking anything of it. Well, a little while later, he heard this soft whimpering sound coming from the hallway. When he crept out to look, he saw a young girl on the floor cradling that doll, as if she were comforting it.
I didn't recognize this girl. She wasn't the neighbor's daughter, and she wasn't one of my sister's friends.
This girl was solid. She wasn't a ghost, so Andy spoke to her. "Are you okay? Who are you?" He thought that maybe she was one of his sister's friends, but she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced up at him with this knowing look and then ran into his mother's bedroom. Well, Andy chased after her, and he entered the bedroom not even a second after she did. But when he got into the room, she was gone, and there was no place to go. She had simply vanished. Well, later he asked his sister and his mother, who was that little girl? And they were both confused. What little girl? Slowly but surely, these apparitions were becoming solid. Well, that night, Andy had the strangest dream. Vivid, almost more real than the waking world. In the dream, he was in the backyard, and the girl from the hallway was sitting up in the apple tree, smiling at him with these powerful, deep blue eyes. And just as he was soaking all of that in, the sky turned dark, and a storm rolled in. Well, the girl's smile morphed into absolute terror, and she climbed down from the tree and then began running in slow motion. Well, Andy watched as a dark, shadowy figure in the form of an old man grabbed her, dragged her away, and then forced her into this little wooden box. Well, she screamed as loudly as she could, and that jarred Andy awake. And as he was coming out of this nightmare, he saw this flash of light at the foot of his bed. He looked down and he saw a swirling purple orb. Well, it hovered for just a second, and then it faded. He never saw the girl or the orb again. Well, not long after this, in the summer of 1992, Andy's friend Damien, not to be confused with your commentator, Damon, came over to play. And as they were approaching the house, Damien thought that he had seen someone standing in Andy's bedroom window. Well, Andy told him that the house was haunted. So when they got upstairs, Damien began jumping up and down on the bed and calling out to the ghost in this teasing voice. Well, instantly, the atmosphere in the room changed. The light dimmed, and a shadow appeared right between the two boys.
The shadow was back, but it was standing in front of the cupboard between me and my friend. It was answering his summons. It had come to play.
Damien screamed, and he ran from the room in terror. But on his way out, Andy got caught running through part of the shadow.
I felt weird running through this thing. It was like time stopped for a long moment. I couldn't breathe. Then, I felt a powerful grip around my waist.
A moment later, Andy felt as if he were drowning. And then suddenly, the universe changed. And now, check this out. He found himself not only someplace else, but somehow he had become someone else.
I could hear an owl hooting, and I could see dirt on my hands. But they were not my hands. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore, and I was not in my own body. My hands were old, wrinkled, and ingrained with years of muck. Dirty fingernails, bitten down below the nail line, topped these alien hands. I felt nerves that were not my own. And as I looked up, I could see lantern lights chasing me through a graveyard.
Suddenly, the spell was broken, and Andy was standing back in his bedroom. Well, immediately he ran downstairs. At the bottom, he discovered that there was this big bruise around his waist, apparently where this shadow figure had grabbed him. To Andy, this was tangible evidence that this whole thing had been real. Whatever was in that house was no longer content to simply be seen or heard. No. Now it was reaching out and touching the living. And somehow, Andy was seeing things through an old man's eyes. The vision, or whatever it was, of being that old man left Andy shaken to somehow be pulled into somebody else's perspective, to see through eyes that were not his, and to feel fear that did not belong to him was bizarre. The bruise on Andy's waist was proof that whatever it was that had just happened, in some way it had been real. But the house really was just getting started. Eventually, the other family members began to experience the haunting as well, and in the usual ways. It began with loud knocks echoing throughout the house. At times, these knocks got so loud that it sounded as if someone were trying to bust down the doors. Water faucets would turn themselves on and off with no one near them. One evening, everyone clearly heard the sound of somebody tumbling down the stairs. While thinking that someone was hurt, everyone rushed to see, but there was no one there. Then, finally, whatever was happening crossed the line that no ghost story should ever cross, and things became physical. One night, Andy woke up to the silhouette of a man bending over his bed. Well, hoping that maybe it was his mother's boyfriend, John, Andy whispered, "John, is that you?" When he did, the figure slowly straightened up, and as it rose to its full height, Andy could hear the sound of bones cracking. Then its eyes met his, and they were not human. No, they glowed like a cat's eyes in the dark, wide, bright, and completely unnatural. This thing then began to move toward Andy with this weird, stuttering, jerky motion, as though it were maybe glitching in and out of reality.
The smell was damp and earthy, like soil and dirt on a rainy day. It was so strong it made me gag as the repulsiveness filled my senses. It was putrid, and it smelled like death.
Andy remained completely motionless, totally paralyzed with fear, and this thing just kept coming. Then, a moment later, it got right up on him, and it leaned in close. So close, in fact, that Andy could actually feel its breath on his face, hot and wet. What was this thing? It definitely was not human. Well, then it touched him. This cold, clammy hand gripped his arm. What could only be explained as powerful, painful static crackled across his skin like 1,000 fiery hot needles. Well, that gave Andy his voice, and he screamed as loudly as he could. And just as his mother was racing into the room, this shadowy thing released Andy's arm and then melted into one of the many shadows on the floor, dissolving as though it had never been there in the first place. Andy's mother flipped on the light, and she found Andy shaking and struggling to breathe. This entity was now inflicting real damage on the living, but soon it was going to take things to a whole new level.
Velarcana.
Late one evening, while Andy was in his room alone, he saw a reflection in his bedroom window, and now we've come full circle. The image in the reflection was bone-chilling.
I saw a man standing in the reflection of the window, holding onto my bed. He had a thick neck and wiry dark grey hair on the sides of his head. He was crouching over my bed in the reflection.
Andy immediately recognized the man's hands. They were the same wrinkled, dirt-ingrained hands that he had seen during the incident when his friend Damien had come to visit.
I didn't want to turn around, but instinct made me. As I did, I couldn't see him, so I looked back toward the glass, and he was still in the reflection.
Well, before he could react, Andy felt himself violently jerked off of the bed. A strong hand had clamped around his ankle like a vice, and now he was being dragged across the floor. His attacker smelled putrid, like old earth and decaying flesh. And then, to make matters worse, the old man taunted him with a question.
What's the matter, Andy? Are you scared?
Then the rain came. But here's the interesting part. The old man hadn't actually dragged him outside yet. It were as if Andy were in two places at once, half in and half out of our universe. In one perspective, he was still there in his bedroom. He could actually see his bed, the desk, his dresser. But all of his other sensations, well, they were someplace else. He could feel earth beneath him, and the rain was still coming down on his face. And he could smell old dampness in the air. And he could hear that terrible sound of someone digging. And he definitely was still locked in this old man's grip.
I felt hands on my shoulders, and I could barely move. It felt like he was pushing me through the floor. In my mind, I could see images. I could see an old torchlight, like the ones they use in the mines. I could hear digging, and I could feel the rain on my face. There were shouts and screams, and then there was a fall. After that, there was just silence and blackness.
A moment later, Andy's mother entered the room, and she found Andy paralyzed on the floor. And now, check this out. When she tried to pull him up, something grabbed onto her and then violently threw her backwards, and she hit the floor hard. And for just a moment, both of them were powerless against whatever this was that was in the room. Well, eventually, this presence retreated, but the damage had been done. Well, after that, the family could no longer stay in that house. They moved out as quickly as they could, and even as they packed, they felt as if something were watching them. Sometime later, Andy came to the chilling conclusion that he had not just experienced a normal haunting. No, somehow he had experienced life in another time, through another person's eyes. Andy never did learn who the old man was, but suggests that maybe he was a gravedigger who used to live in that house and then died there. But that wasn't quite satisfying enough for Amy, so she did some digging. First, she looked for missing children, or for just a single missing little girl, in the decades before Andy's family moved into that house, but she wasn't able to find anything. However, she did find information on resurrection men. Now, I thought this was extremely interesting. In 19th century Britain, medical schools desperately needed dead bodies for anatomy lessons. But as you can imagine, the legal supply of dead bodies was extremely limited. So an underground trade emerged. Men known as resurrection men stole freshly buried corpses from graves and then sold them to surgeons and anatomy schools. What? Well, to avoid harsher charges, they often left the jewelry, clothing, and coffin goods behind. Believe it or not, the body itself existed in this strange legal gray area. So the goal was simple: take the corpse, refill the grave, and make it look as though nothing had happened. This might explain the digging. The old man running through the graveyard feeling like he was being chased because he was a grave robber. But at least for me, it doesn't explain the little girl running for her life, being captured, and then being shoved into that box, right? In the end, I guess this story truly is a mystery. The information for this mystery comes from the book The Haunting on Park Road by Andrew Hopkins. That's the man who experienced it. Amy reached out to Andrew, and he responded. Unfortunately, our schedules couldn't line up, and we weren't able to do an interview. But he did tell Amy that every single word in that book is true, and this story happened exactly as he shared it. Researching the story, Amy went at it like she always does, from every angle. Of course, she read the book, then she spent time with this man over the phone asking him all kinds of questions. She watched several interviews with this guy, and then she looked up the property records of the house, which he gave us the address, but he asked us to keep that private, as the people who currently live there don't want any publicity. She researched cases of possible serial killers or missing girls from the 1800s all the way through to just before his family moved into the house, and, as I said earlier, she didn't find anything. She even read through old journals and archived documents for any connection between the Coalville area and the haunting in this house. And she even tried to find Ethel, that friendly ghost that Andy met first. And although there is indeed a house there on Park Road, and Andrew Hopkins and his family did live there, well, the rest of the story wasn't easily verifiable. And the actual haunting itself, well, all we have to go on for that, of course, is just Andy's word. He claims that For years, he lived with this terrible experience in silence, haunted by a shadow that somehow got onto the inside of his mind, being taken into another place in another time and then seeing life through an old man's eyes, being dragged across his bedroom floor by something that should not have been able to touch him. Well, if all of that really happened, well, then his experience is intense, right? Andrew Hopkins went on to become a spiritual medium and a paranormal investigator, and he has spent more than 20 years now helping others who find themselves living with unexplained phenomena like he did. Perhaps he was always meant to be on that path. Or maybe the house on Park Road showed him that, at a very young age, that the veil between this world and whatever lies beyond is a little thinner than most people want to believe. This story seems to show that some houses just might remember what happened inside of them. And now, with Andrew as an example, we see that maybe some children are sensitive enough, and maybe unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to not only hear and see those memories, but also somehow to relive them. Chilling.
After digging into Andy's story, I'll just say this. I believe him. I did try to verify what I could, and I even contacted our moderator, Vess, who lives in the UK, to see if he could find anything extra on that area. And he was able to locate a few details that Andy had mentioned in the book, including the church nearby and the pub near his house on Park Road. But the part of Andy's story that really stayed with me was the way he didn't just see the old man. At times, it seemed like he almost merged with him, seeing through the old man's eyes, feeling his hands, his fear, his memories. In mediumship, some people might call that mediumistic blending or even overshadowing, when a sensitive person temporarily picks up on the thoughts, emotions, or impressions of a spirit. And speaking of seeing things, take a look at our Buy Me a Coffee page. Supporting us there really helps keep us digging into strange stories like this one. And as always, stay curious.